Hello everyone, welcome to the CW DCTV weekly reviews. Before I start off this week, I just want to say that there obviously will be spoilers throughout this video. First up, I want to discuss Supergirl Season 2, Episode 11, The Martian Chronicles. Now, if you remember from last week's episode, we all know that the White Martians were coming because they are after Megan Moores, and they of course show up in this episode. I initially thought we would get perhaps an army of White Martians to come and get her, but no, I guess one or two would be a little bit more subtle. Also, it ended up being a very interesting episode from that perspective. I loved how this episode felt like the John Carpenter film The Thing. If you are familiar with that film, you understood the references in it, specifically the scene where they were testing to see who in fact was a White Martian and not a human. That was entirely an homage to a sequence in that film. I have made it no mystery that one of my favorite aspects of the entire Supergirl show is Martian Manhunter. I love everything they do surrounding his character. Whether it be his origin, or whether it be his dealings with the DEO, or in this situation, his relationship with Megan Moores, and her having to deal with the White Martians, because he, as we know, has a very traumatic past dealing with the White Martians. And in this episode, we got to see a little bit more of that, but what we also got to see is that he has now fully accepted Megan Moores into his life. He has a lot of strong feelings for her, specifically romantic feelings, that he readily expresses in this episode, and it makes it all that kind of bittersweet that at the end she ends up going back to Mars to save the more benevolent White Martians. But what we also got in this episode, which I really liked, was more of the relationship between Kara and her sister. As we know now, Alex is in a full-on relationship with Maggie Sawyer, and Kara is feeling kind of a little bit left out. What we found out is that she doesn't want to be abandoned by Alex, and I thought it was a very heartwarming moment of the episode. Granted, the context of it was that she was talking to a White Martian who happened to take the identity of Alex, but still, it was a really heavy, good moment of the episode. I also really liked how very self-contained this episode was. One of the things in the episode that I really didn't like was the very end of the episode where Kara is about to confront Mon-El about the feelings that she has for him, and he has already moved on to another person. I found that to be extremely cliched and something that they fall back on too much when it comes to writing relationships in these types of shows. And it really bothered me because I think we all know that Mon-El and Kara are going to be together romantically in the future. It is just a matter of time. So overall, for an episode that wasn't quite a filler episode, but didn't really deal with Cadmus or Lena Luthor or anything like that, it was rather entertaining. Also, a lot of good stuff with the Martian Manhunter. So moving on to The Flash, this week was Season 3, Episode 12, titled Untouchable. Now that title has to deal with the bad guy of the week in this episode, who, every time he touched you, you would slowly decompose until you died. And while I'm typically harsh when it comes to kind of more of the Monster of the Week type episodes, because I think that the monsters are typically weak in general, this week I thought he was quite formidable, so I really liked that aspect of this episode. Yet again, we're getting more of these filler type episodes with Monsters of the Week, but I really liked this episode. I also really liked the fact that Joe now knows about the possible future where Iris dies, and that is something that I thought to be a particularly powerful moment in this episode because Joe is extremely close to his children, including Barry, and to finally find this out, I thought was a great thing. Also, we got to see Julian have a more active role as not only part of Team Flash, but have a personal invested stake in stopping someone. because this particular monster of the week was someone that he created when he was under Savitar's control, so he feels personally responsible for it. And we see in this episode how personal he is taking all of this. And I really like that they're working with Julian a lot more. I particularly am liking his relationship with Caitlin. They're slowly growing their relationship in a more organic way than I think we typically see in shows like this. Of course, that could all be taken away where they're a romantic couple in the next 2 episodes or whatever. Also, in this episode, we get to see Barry and Wally race for the first time. They really are hammering home how fast Wally is, especially when comparison to Barry. And I think they're building up to something in that respect. I know they are supposed to be training up for Wally to save Iris from Savitar in the future, but I think they're doing something more with that. Perhaps Wally may move on to another place where he could be of more service, because I think we're having too many speedsters in Central City. As we saw in this episode, Wally is apparently really popular amongst the people of Central City, more popular than the Flash is, which I thought was very interesting. Also, back to Caitlin, she got to use her powers once again in this episode, and we see that the more she uses her powers, the more she is susceptible to Killer Frost taking over. It was a very interesting aspect of the episode where we got to see how she was kind of talked back from the ledge by Julian to really remain the Caitlin Snow that we know and not become Killer Frost. Also, I think we all kind of assumed that Iris would have eventually been okay. They're not going to kill off a major character like this. I think if they do, it will be by Savitar, and maybe it won't be Iris West, it could be someone else. Overall, a good filler episode for The Flash. So moving on to Arrow, Season 5, Episode 12, titled Bratva. And in this episode, we get to see Oliver and Team Arrow travel to Russia, and we get to see the flashbacks and the main storyline kind of butt heads a little bit, because we do see some of the characters from the flashbacks in the modern timeline, and it's very cool to see. In this episode, Team Arrow is hunting down the general who framed John Diggle, who is on the loose, who's trying to sell nuclear arms in Russia, and it was a very good episode. I loved the way the flashbacks are working with the show right now. It's the strongest it's been in seasons. I say it in every review almost, and they just keep doing it every week. And in the flashbacks, we get more of his relationship with Talia al Ghul. We got to see from last week that she is the one who gave him his Arrow uniform, essentially, or at least the early version of that uniform. And also, we get to learn that he was performing these type of assassinations in Russia, and then he had this code name, and it is very interesting how that's working into the main plot, especially when it comes to, I guess, Oliver's new girlfriend, who is really kind of only using him to really find out more of his connection with the Arrow. I think now she knows or she assumes that Oliver Queen is the Green Arrow. We also got to say goodbye to kind of a new member of Team Arrow, and that is Ragman, who no longer has use of his mystical rags that give him his abilities because he prevented a nuclear blast. Could this be a trend where members start leaving? We've already seen one betray the group and leave. We've seen Ragman now leave because he no longer can use his powers. Who else is left to go? In this episode, Wild Dog stays behind in Star City to watch over Quentin Lance, who I guess is acting mayor that Oliver Queen is now out of the country, and he is fresh out of rehab, and he wants to do an interview openly discussing his alcoholism, and that is an interesting part of the episode where he has to deal with a lot of past issues as well. Of course, the death of his daughters, as well as a lot of other personal things. And he and Wildman's relationship is interesting. It's contentious, it's darkly comedic. Ultimately, they find a way to respect one another by the end, which I thought was really, really good. So this was probably the best episode of the week out of all of the shows for me. Arrow is really killing it this season. Hopefully they continue the trend going forward. And now we've come to Legends of Tomorrow, our wild card show, if you will. Every single week I watch the show, and every single week I either have a lot of fun with it or I start questioning whether I want to keep watching it. But this week we go back in time, back to the American Revolution, to prevent the assassination of George Washington. You hear that plot and you think, man, this sounds kind of crazy. And with Legends of Tomorrow, it probably is. But there are a few new wrinkles in this episode. As we know from last week, Captain Rip Hunter didn't have his memories, and now he does, but he's also a bad guy now. And I have to say, the actor who plays Captain Rip Hunter is a really good bad guy. Hopefully they keep him as a bad guy for the remainder of the season. Perhaps in the season finale, we get the Captain Rip Hunter back that we all knew from before, but I really like him as a member of the Legion of Doom. He is formidable, he knows this team, he knows their weaknesses, he knows how to fight them. And as we saw in this episode, he attacks them rather unmercifully. He shoots Sarah, he uses some type of EMP blast to knock out the ship and knock out their specific weaponry or things of that nature, and he ends up, allegedly killing Sarah at the end of this episode. She, of course, is saved at the very last second by Gideon, but I'm telling you, he is a formidable bad guy, and that's what I really like about this season. The bad guys with the Legion of Doom, and now with Captain Rip Hunter, are all a lot more formidable than last season. So the show has definitely found its footing in that respect. This is Season 2, Episode 11, titled Turncoat, which of course is a direct reference to Rip Hunter. This was a good episode for Legends of Tomorrow. It was something that moved along the overall plot line, which was great to see, and it was a lot of fun. That is yet again the main theme of Legends of Tomorrow, is fun. So that has been the CW DCTV weekly reviews. If you like this video, please check out my other videos on my channel.